Hello, everybody. Welcome back to Quest for Truth. The passage that we're looking at this week is Luke chapter 16, verses 19 through 31. And it is the story that Jesus tells of the rich man and Lazarus. And we don't really know. Some people think that it is a story of something that actually happened, and some people think that it is just a parable. And that's not really important. What really is important is the parabolic understanding of the story, because Jesus is telling this story. So we have to understand why he's telling us this story. And it's also important to keep it in context, and we'll look at the context of it as we get into it. So we start off with the first two verses here. Now there was a rich man, and he habitually dressed in purple and fine linen, joyously living in splendor every day. And a poor man named Lazarus was laid at his gate, covered with sores, and longing to be fed with the crumbs which were falling from the rich man's table. Besides, even the dogs were coming and licking his sores. So in the first few verses here, we have these two characters, these two people that are set as the central characters of this story, which are the rich man and the poor man who is named Lazarus. Now, when we look at this rich man poor man scenario here, we have to look at it in context, like I said. And what is the context of this passage? We have to go back to the last passage, and if you listen to our video last week, you'd probably already get this. But if you just look at verse 13, it says, "No servant can serve two masters, for either he will hate the one and love the other, or else he will be devoted to one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and wealth." And wealth there meaning really physical possessions. So you can't serve God and wealth. And so this story here is essentially a rich man who has served wealth, who has built up his wealth, who has lived to get rich, to have physical things, and to enjoy them. And then on the other side, you have this poor man, Lazarus, who did not serve wealth, rather he served God. And so you see that, he's this servant of God, and here he's, poor, but that's not, we see that this idea of being poor isn't a really a moniker of who he is, but rather it's really that he was serving God, not serving wealth. So let's get into these verses here. So you see this rich man, he dressed in purple, fine linen, and joyously living in splendor every day. So he dressed in purple, he was ornate, he was, dressed like royalty. He had all of the things. He lived with everything that he could have. He, like I said, he lived to serve his wealth and enjoy his physical possessions that he had. And then on the opposite side, you have the poor man, Lazarus. And again, he's named here, which is very important, because the idea of having a named character, especially at the time, but even still today, when you say a rich man, it's kind of a throwaway. It's a background character. It's not the main character. The main character has a name. And so this poor man is actually, just in being named, is being presented above the rich man, which would have been a huge wrench in the thought of the Pharisees, which is who this is actually being told to. If you go back to to verse 14, 15. So this is continuing on that narrative being spoken to the Pharisees. And so this poor man Lazarus, he was at the gate of the rich man, and he was covered in sores. His health was not good. And he was just hoping to get crumbs from the rich man's table. And that even the dogs were coming and licking the sores, meaning he was so detestable that the dogs, which were the worst of the worst, essentially, dogs weren't like they are today. They weren't household pets, they were wild animals. And so only the dogs would come and give him any amount of anything for his pain, and nobody else really cared about him because he was a poor man, and he didn't have any reason to attract people outside of being a person. And so no one came to take care of him. No one came to help him or anything. And so that is the foundation, right? You have these two scenarios, the serving God and the serving of wealth. And the similar thing about both is they both die. And you'll see that in the next couple of verses, starting in verse 22. Now the poor man died and was carried away by the angels to Abraham's bosom. And the rich man also died and was buried. In Hades he lifted up his eyes, being in torment, and saw Abraham far away and Lazarus in his bosom. So like I said, both of them die. And the detail is very interesting, because you see the one, Lazarus died, and he was carried away by the angels to Abraham's bosom. The man who had no friends on earth to help him was carried away by the angels and taken to Abraham's bosom. And it says the rich man also died and was buried. And you see that the difference here, right, it kind of switches, because before you have this, the rich man lives this ornate life, this physical life of seeking after physical wealth, and the poor man who sought after God and has had nothing. And then you see the poor man who's carried away by angels, spiritual beings, into the next life, into Abraham's bosom, which we'll talk about in a second. And then the rich man also died and was buried. It just talks about his physical body. His physical body was put into the ground. And that's all it says, right? And then it continues to say he's in Hades, but it's interesting that that it's his physical body that's buried, and he's dead, and then he's in Hades. Now, when we talk about Abraham's bosom and Hades, what we're talking about is really this kind of the pre-Jesus idea of death, basically, which is Sheol in the Old Testament, and which technically directly translates to Hades, but in the New Testament, the Greek word for Hades is used in a negative light. So even though Abraham's bosom, this place of joy and gladness and happiness, sort of like, it's kind of basically heaven, and Hades are both in this realm of the dead. They are very different, and we'll see that in a second too. So we see the difference here of, the poor man Lazarus going to Abraham's bosom, place of joy and happiness, and the rich man going to Hades and torment. So he sees Abraham far away and Lazarus at his side. And so going back to verse 24, and he cried out and said, Father Abraham, have mercy on me, and send Lazarus so that he may dip the tongue of his finger in water and cool off my tongue, for I am in agony in this flame. But Abraham said, Child, remember that during your life you received your good things, and likewise Lazarus bad things. But now he is being comforted here, and you are in agony. And besides all this, between us and you, there is a great chasm fixed, so that those who wish to come over from here to you will not be able, and that none may cross over from there to us. And so the rich man in Hades sees Abraham and Lazarus, and he cries out to Abraham to send Lazarus just to dip his finger in water so that he might cool his tongue. That's what he thought of. It's very interesting because he's in agony, he's in torment with no hope, and yet he still looks at Lazarus as just he could be some kind of a, he could be a servant to me. He could serve me by cooling off my tongue. That's what he thought about Lazarus. But Abraham reminds him that during your life you had good things and Lazarus bad things. And keep in mind that Lazarus was right outside of the rich man's gate. And the rich man could have had pity on Lazarus, but he didn't. And now he expects, in return, Lazarus to serve him. But he is being comforted. The one who chose to serve God is being comforted, and you are in agony. And then they say that there's a great chasm here. There's this great separation. So between Hades and Abraham's side, there is a great chasm and a impassable chasm, meaning that you can't go from one side to the other. It is a permanent place based on the decision that you made, based on what you chose to serve. Did you serve God or did you serve wealth? And if you serve God, then you go to this place of the Abraham side of comfort. And if you chose to serve wealth, then you received your reward on earth. You received your good things on earth. And you go to a place of torment. And then he continues and he says, the rich man says to Abraham, again, because Lazarus, he couldn't even speak to Lazarus. He says to Abraham, then I beg you, Father, that you send him to my father's house, for I have 5 brothers, in order that he may warn them, so that they will not also come to this place of torment. But Abraham said, they have Moses and the prophets, let them hear them. But he said to them, no, Father Abraham, but if someone goes to them from the dead, they will repent. But he said to him, if they do not listen to Moses and the prophets, They will not be persuaded, even if someone rises from the dead. So again, the rich man thinks that Lazarus should be nothing more than a messenger. He thinks that he should be able to send him back to his father's house to warn his brothers about what's to come, so they don't also come here. Now, you might, you kind of start to think, gee, this guy actually does have a heart. He cares about his brothers, and that's about all that he cares about. But he doesn't want his brothers coming to this place, his family. That's the extent of his caring. But Abraham said they have Moses and the prophets. So Moses and the prophets, refers to the Old Testament, right? They had the Old Testament, and the Old Testament is the gospel. There's, the gospel is all throughout the Old Testament. A couple years ago, we talked about Leviticus, and we touched on this idea of the gospel being in Leviticus. All of these sacrifices and all of these things pointing to Christ, pointing to the gospel. And it's so much throughout, from the very beginning. You have this idea of the seed. And so the gospel is all throughout the Old Testament. And so it's basically saying, you have the gospel, let them hear the gospel from the prophets. But he says, no, if someone comes from the dead, they will repent. And the response here, as Jesus said this, I can imagine he was only thinking forward, because we're on this road to Jerusalem, remember. So as Jesus says this last remark from, what Abraham says in the story, but he says, if they do not listen to Moses and the prophets, they will not be persuaded, even if someone rises from the dead. And Jesus, rose from the dead. And it's incredible, as believers, it's incredible to think about how people can't believe when you have someone rise from the dead, and yet here you have it said, Jesus said, if you don't believe in the gospel from the prophets, from Moses, then you're not going to believe even if someone raises from the dead. Even if Jesus raises from the dead, they still won't believe. And so all throughout this passage here, we see, again, these two ideas, right? You see the serving God, and you see serving the physical, the wealth. And you see those who serve God receiving what they didn't get on earth, receiving the comfort from God that we didn't, we don't seek comfort, we don't seek out those good things, we seek God. But in the end, in this time in heaven, we will receive those good things. And we see those who sought wealth on this earth will receive what is due them, which is just punishment, which for their sins. And this is also a great example here of why, the prosperity gospel isn't biblical, because earthly prosperity means nothing to your spiritual position. God didn't save us to make us rich. He didn't save us to give us money. He saved us so that we could be free from the consequence of our sin and be with him forever in eternity.